guys. Just wanted to let you know that in case you didn't catch this, we're talking about a saying that Jesus gave that appears in Mark, Luke, and Matthew. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Got that? So that's where I'm coming from this morning. I'm doing the love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind. So, how many of you guys have ever been in love? How many of you guys have ever been in love and never told anybody that you love them? Let me tell you a little quick story about my 5th grade experience. Back in the dark ages, and I'm 72 going on 73, so that was a long time ago, okay? Long before you were born, probably long before some of your parents were born. Don't tell them that, though. Anyway, I was in 5th grade at Fairmont Elementary School in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is right near, not too far from where I was born. And there was a gal in the class by the name of Julie Swanson. Now, I've not seen Julie since the 5th grade, and I've never talked to her since then. But we had what we called in those days slam books. You know what a slam book is, anybody? It's a book where you answer a bunch of different questions, but you put your name by a certain number. So you give an answer to every question according to your number, okay? So if I wanted to ask, what's my favorite color, I'd put since say I was number 5 when I started that slam book, I would put my name, my name, or the color blue, okay? I like blue for some reason or other, I don't know why. But anyway, at the back of the book is the one last question, and it's the zinger. Whom do you love? And of course, Mom and Dad don't count at that point in 5th grade. So I wrote down Julie Swanson because she was a pretty girl. Looked a little bit like you ladies here on the front row. The hair was sort of like that style back in the day. And so I wrote that down there. But you know, you're always tempted to look at other people's answers on that page too. And I found Royall Yunt's name written down by somebody. And I looked back to find out who was number 13 or 12 or 5 or 6 or whatever it was back in those days. And it was a girl named Linda Sampsell, who was also in my class, and she was blonde. Hair not quite as long as yours, Lauren, but blonde. And boy, guess what I did? I went back into the back of the book, erased Julie Swanson's name, and wrote Linda Sampsell's name in the book instead. And we sort of carried on a conversation there. I do remember one painful afternoon when she had invited me over to her house, and my mother said I could not go because there was nobody else home at the time. And I remember I went outside and raked leaves. Can you believe that? Kind of crazy. I raked leaves and sang songs to myself the whole time. That's how I got over that little painful hump. Went to 6th grade, and Linda and I were a sort of an item at that point because we didn't have middle school back in those days. It was elementary school, junior high, starting in 7th. So when I went off to 7th grade, Linda disappeared, and I have never seen her since. But she is probably the first real girlfriend I ever had. And it's kind of neat to remember her. And that's kind of a cue because I think we answer back to people who care about us. I mean, we really do. I mean, if you want to think about the folks in your life so far who have been somebody you counted as special or dear or that you loved, they are folks that probably reached out to you first. And so I started thinking about that. And I have a list. Now I want to know if any of you know these people, okay? Dr. William C. Schaefer. Dr. Schaefer sat with me when I was 6 years old at a Synod assembly in the adult thing, okay? And talked to me about being a pastor. 6 years old. He took time out to sit down and talk to me. Mrs. Camilla Tribal. She was once escorted to the stage by none other than John Philip Sousa. If you don't know who that is, if you've ever heard a marching song on the playing field at halftime, one of them probably was written by John Philip Sousa. Great band leader sometime around the early 1900s. Mr. Paul Connect, Sunday school teacher. Pastor Bill Johnson, a friend that my wife and I have in common but never knew at the same time. Pastor Ken Linton, the reason I ever became a pastor, because he was so much like what I thought a pastor ought to be. Dr. Axel Kildegard, my first quarter program leader when I entered seminary, and introduced me to what life in Chicago, which is where I went to seminary, was all about. Bishop Carl Sagerhammer, Ken and Jenny Wallace, friends of ours in Hot Springs. Ken has died of cancer about 2 years ago. Jenny is still alive, and we just talked to her last week. Steve Buck was just in the room some minute ago, two ago. He's 14 feet tall and red-haired. You may have seen him at church at first service anyway. He's a former member, friend of mine from Holy Trinity, where I served last before I retired. But he's also a former neighbor of mine in my old neighborhood before we moved. Bill Britton, Bill McCullough, Sandy Brown, Bishop Robert Studman, Randy and Mary Beth Newhouse. Know who they are? You've heard of that name. But you may have heard of Bob and Karen Miller, or maybe not. Both those couples are members of Good Shepherd. They're the reasons my wife and I now live in Carolina Arbors, because one time at two different occasions, they talked to us about their new home and what they were doing in this new neighborhood. And both my wife and I knew we were getting old. I'm supposed to laugh at that. Encourage me. No, shake your heads no. Say something encouraging, okay? And that's why we looked into it and we were sold. We moved there back in April of last year. Pastor Tim Brown, you know him? Yeah. Pastor Louise Hilbert, you know her? Pastor Marcia Anderson, know her? Pastor David Sloop? Some? And there are more and more and more and more. And every one of those people have sort of nudged me, and I looked back at them the other night. I have a tendency to wake up in the middle of the night and to think about things that I need to do. And one of them was to talk to you guys about how do you love God with all your heart and soul and mind. And I think one of the first ways you do it is you recognize who has been near and dear to you, maybe even nudged you a little bit. And then you say, to nobody in particular, but probably most importantly to God, thank you. Thank you for these folks. Thank you for giving me Quentin Garman, who was the senior pastor when I was an associate pastor, fresh out of seminary, newly ordained, living in California in San Diego. Gorgeous place, lovely non-humidity, sunshine every day. I was on the coast. I mean, I went out and watched whales go by. That's how great it was. And he was an absolute pain in the tailbone because he pushed and made me work really hard. But I got to tell you, I learned more from Quentin P. Garman than I have learned from many people in my life, mainly because he made me listen. And he made me do it because he had the authority. He was the boss. Okay? So, we have this whole idea about being thankful for the folks that God has sent us. Have any of you got folks like that in your life already? Nod your head yes, because if you're all sitting here at least awake this morning, you probably do. And the other piece I would say to you, the other piece I think you need to think about on this in terms of how you love God, you can go and pick it up, that's okay. I drop things all the time. That way you can thank God for and love God, but for being who the one he has sent all these people to you, is to talk to God. For those of you who've ever been in love, what would you do if you loved somebody but couldn't talk to them? Now, maybe when you're your age, and some of you were like me when I was 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, older, some of you guys maybe, I was afraid. I was afraid to talk to girls. Not my cup of tea at all. First, that's new. I'm fresh out of the gate in that deal. But it was important to me to remember these people because, and I needed to tell somebody about it, and the one I usually talk to is God. If I'm driving down the road, I can remember driving home from my church office in Hot Springs, Arkansas, where I served for 17 years. And I would see a sunset coming across the top of the road in the middle of winter with dead trees everywhere, and it would be a lovely pink blue sky. And all I could think of was, thank you. And you don't have to be fancy with talking to God. God's more interested in your heart for a very important reason. A very important reason. Because, and I want you to take and hold your hand for a moment. You can hold the person next to you if you want to, but at least hold your own hand, all right? And I want you to know that you're touching the one who is one of God's weak spots. In all of the universe, bless your hearts. It's lovely, boys, it's lovely. For if you think about what the Bible has told us about what Jesus did and continues to do for us, it reminds us that you and I are always going to be loved by God. Why would God send his only son to die for us if we weren't somehow in the picture? What difference does it make? I think God's weakness is you and me. And I give thanks for that. And so I have a longer list than the one I've just read to you, those 21 names of folks that have been important to me. There are so many more. I didn't even mention my wife. Don't tell her that, lady. I mean, Naomi. And that's another thing. I have a fairly decent memory for names, but if I get on a different name, sometimes I'll go off the rails. And I have called Naomi Natalie for I don't know how long now. Years. And just slap me. Just slap me. I'll get around. Come around to it. But it's important that we think about these things because they're part of the interior life that sort of lets God in and brings God closer to us, or at least it keeps the door open so God can do something with you. Okay? Sometimes it's not what we do, but it's what God's already doing. That leads us to a whole bunch of new stuff. Who knew that I would end up living just 3 hours away from the one place on earth I thought God had made closest to heaven? And that's Hickory, North Carolina, which is where my 4 grandparents, John Ernest and Mamie Lee Townsend, and Floyd Stephen and Lottie Mae Yunt lived, whom I idolized from way back. And I still think about them, talk about them. I can only find one home place that has nothing left of it except it does have a bench where I watched my grandfather throw horseshoes that I still recall. I still remember sitting under the tree and sort of baiting my granddad about a variety of things, including the fact that the Yunts were related to Herbert Hoover, and who was a Republican president back in the late 1920s during the Great Depression, and whom my grandfather absolutely, as a Democrat, did not like. And we used to enjoy watching him get beat red because he was so mad that we brought this up. And I know that even today that he's probably not happy with me mentioning that to you all, and telling you as well. But the older you get, the more history you're going to have. And those are ways that give us entry into ways you and I can find to love God. Thank you for being here this morning. And it's good to talk with you. Good to see you guys.